Likutei Sichos, Chelik of Zion, volume 27, the first Sicha for Parshas Acharei. This Sicha will explain the imperative for one to, on the one hand, be spiritual, connected to Hashem, but yet always to remain with their feet on the ground, meaning anchored in this world and even in worldly matters. Why is this so? Because this is ultimately the desire of Hashem in the creation of the world, namely, as it says in the Medrash, Nisava Kadosh Baruch Hu Liyas La'idira B'Tachteinu, that Hashem desired to have a dwelling place down here in this world. As an introduction, just to familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts that will be discussed in the Sicha. So there's a concept of Rotzoi and Shuv. Rotzoi literally means to a thrust forward, meaning to have a strong, intense desire to connect to something. Thus, you have a forward motion. Shuv comes from the word lashuv, which means to return, which means to have, so to speak, a plan of settling it down, not just to go without any consequence, but to have a planned, if I may, a planned rotzoi, which will allow for the person to bring it back down to reality, so to speak. If I had to find an example for it, just as a means of metaphor, but it's not a perfect example, it's not enough for scientists to design a space shuttle that can go up in space, but rather, and perhaps most of the focus has to be, is how does it come back down to space? Because ultimately the idea is getting that shuttle, getting that plane back here onto the ground safely. So Rotzoi is not enough. Rotzoi is sending it up. That's also important. But Shuv is how to bring it back down. In other words, how to bring it into the reality. Now there's another concept which will appear in the Sicha, and that is Yoshvei Oyhel, literally translated, those who sit in the tents, versus Bali Asek, business people. This typically is the divide, the separation of the two types of Jews, namely the ones that are more focused or mostly focused in their life, primarily on Yoshvei Oyel, on sitting in the tent, that is the tents of Torah and service of Hashem. That's not to say that the others are not, but however, the others, the Bali Asik, those people who are involved in business life, meaning in the day-to-day world that we live in, that their primary occupation doesn't always seem to be constantly focused on the spiritual, rather they're invested and busy with the material. The truth is that this really amounts to most of the Jewish people. The greater percentage of the Jewish population, we're talking about even observant Jews, people who are cognitive and aware of the fact that our life has to be a Torah life, yet most Jews, because of the way Hashem designed it, not because we're going against His will, Hashem made it so that most people have to be occupied and involved in worldly matters. Another thing to be familiar with is a Gemara in Bama Metzia that brings a very interesting story, a tale about a dispute, a debate that went on b'Masifta Derikia, that is the yeshiva, I guess you could say the Talmudical Academy of the heavens. And there Hashem and the students there had a debate where Hashem said about a certain matter that it's Toher, that it's pure, and they insisted that it isn't. In order to resolve the matter, the Gemara says, they called out and they said, who is present here? Meaning, who is present from the lower world? Who is present from the world, the material world, the physical world? And they said, oh, Rabbi Bar Nachmani. And Rabbi Bar Nachmani happens to be an expert in this subject, in this matter, and therefore he will resolve it. We'll see later how this plays a role in the Sicha. Now, finally, of course, just to refamiliarize ourselves with the topic of the discussion here, and that is what exactly happened with the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu. We know that Nadav and Avihu, it says they took their incense and they went in unauthorized to the Holy of Holies and they perished. And there are two major reasons given for why they deserve this, or why this happened. One, as evident from the fact that immediately thereafter, Hashem immediately instructed the Kohanim, all the priests, Yayin v'sheichar al teish, you should not drink, you should not be intoxicated with wine when you go into the holies. And then, as appears in our parsha, as it says, you should not always come in, meaning you should not come in unauthorized. You can't just always come in. You can't always be attached. There are certain times, there's a time and place for coming in to and getting connected with the holies. And both of these are actual reasons for what happened, as we'll see as it plays out in the Sicha. So let's get into the Sicha itself. We know that generally the Torah is a book of instructions. In fact, the word Torah, the meaning of the word, the etymology of the word is Hayra'ah, instruction. Thus, every single word in the Torah is a word of instruction. Even, perhaps especially, the stories in the Torah, the anecdotes, the narratives, what seems to be history, is not just there as a story. It's not there, God forbid, just for entertainment or information, but rather it is there to teach us how to live our life, what to do or what not to do. The only distinction is that most of the time there are stories in the Torah, throughout the Torah, which in order to become privy to their inner meaning and to have a good appreciation as to what life lessons they're giving us, what instructional qualities they have, we have to sometimes resort to, most times, resort to the Talmud or the Medrash. In other words, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, to the oral tradition, in order to get an appreciation of it. However, there are rare occasions, and one of them is in our Parsha, where the Torah itself, meaning the Torah Shebiksav, the written law, gives us a clear understanding as to what the lessons of that story is. And that is in the story of Nadav and Avihu. They went in, they died. And immediately the Torah tells us what we should conclude from the story by means of giving us instruction. Do not do this, do not do that. However, it came in two phases. Immediately in Parsha Shmini, which is 2.5 parshas ago, when this happened, immediately Hashem turns to Aaron and his sons and he says, Yayin v'sheichar al teish. You should not drink wine and become intoxicated and then go into the holies. Then, 2.5 parshas later, in our parsha, where it begins to talk about the service of Yom Kippur, here it tells us, Ve'al yavai b'chol eisel hakodesh, you shouldn't always come into the holies, meaning you shouldn't come in just like that, you shouldn't come in unauthorized. So we need to understand why this distinction, why this split in these two lessons, in these two rules that are directly derived from the episode, from what happened. Why is it that Hashem splits it up and only tells it to us this second lesson, this second Hayra'ah instruction, only 2.5 parshas later? Now, what really happens in these 2.5 parshas? In other words, in between the first directive and now this second directive? Well, in the end of Parsha Shmini, it discussed the various animals, the kosher animals, non-kosher animals, how to make an animal kosher even when it's potentially kosher. That means a little slight nuance and the difference that can render the animal kosher or not, that is namely shchita and so on. And then in the last 2 parshiot, we talk about some severe impurities, the tumah of tsaras, and later the tumah of ziva, and so on. Only after that comes our parsha, Parshas Acharei, where it discusses the idea of Yom Kippur, which Yom Kippur, of course, is the idea of atonement, as its name represents, and then it starts to which is a atonement from non-desirable things, from unpleasant things, right? And only then, does it tell us about this. Now, it's very clear and obvious why the Torah would discuss Yom Kippur only after having discussed the kosher and non-kosher animals, and only after discussing all the various severe impurities. Because when a person is in a spiritual state, when a person is in a state like they were in the beginning of Parsha Shmini, where they were totally and absolutely attached to the holies, they were experiencing the revelation of God's presence, a person doesn't need an atonement. A person is not in that bad place where they need to have a atonement for sins. There are no sins. There isn't any room for sins. Only after having, quote unquote, an involvement, so to speak, with the animalistic aspect of one, the animalistic occurrences in a person's life, the pure ones, the impure ones, and so on. And then later, even perhaps even lower, going to the severe impurities that are presented in Parshas Tazria Mitzayra. Then Hashem tells us there is this idea of atonement. Even from that, yes, you could come back from that. Yom Kippur serves as an atonement even for the most severe, so to speak, stains on one's soul. However, the question remains, why is it that Hashem chose to give us this second instruction, which comes as a direct derivative of this episode with the two sons of Nadav and Avihu, specifically here in the discussion of Yom Kippur? Now, it's true that we have a rule of Ein Mukdam U'Me'ucher B'Torah, that there isn't an absolute chronological order to the Torah. That is true, and therefore one cannot deduce from the fact that something occurs in the Torah that it happened in that time period. It could have happened earlier, it could have happened later. The Torah chose to mention it at that point, but doesn't mean it happened at that point. However, here's the real question. Who dictated the Torah? Whose order is this? This is Hashem's order. So it's obvious that he has a reason. Even though Ein Mukdam U'Me'ucher B'Torah, but there's a reason why the placement of these two instructions would be so far apart, namely 2.5 parshiot apart, and that this placement is specifically with Yom Kippur. And whereas the other instruction came immediately after the episode. The answer is as follows. As we already said in the beginning, the sin of, the quote-unquote sin, the misdeed of the two sons of Aaron was not a sin in the conventional sense. Rather, in accordance with their level, it was considered like a severe offense, a severe sin, and that's why they died. Now, what is it really that they did, that they wanted to do? Which obviously, coming from them, meant that it was an ideal thing to do. However, Hashem was still displeased with it, and that's why it was considered a sin, is the fact that they wanted to become one with Hashem. They had this intense desire to become totally cleaved, totally attached to Hashem, to become detached from anything and everything worldly, and they had klois hanefesh. Basically, the body could not successfully sustain and contain and sustain the soul within it, and therefore their souls departed. And this is considered a sin, an offense. Why? Because true that every single person, not only Nadav and Avihu, every single Jew ideally has to have this desire to get close to Hashem, to become one with Hashem, to become totally bottled in godliness. But still, one must totally maintain a healthy balance in order to successfully always remain body and soul together. Why? Because only that way can one fulfill the true purpose for why God created the world and why he put the soul into the body, namely that we should make a dwelling place, a dir betachtonim. Now, there are two distinctive reasons which can motivate the urge for Ratzoi. As we just said, Ratzoi means this thrust forward, to get close to Hashem, to leave everything behind and just become spiritual. Which means, there's two distinctive reasons that can motivate a person. And like I said, the Ratzoi basically makes a person come close to Hashem, but to the exclusion of all worldly matters. The first motivating thing that can be there, is that a person has this realization of the true greatness of godliness. And in the words of the Or HaChaim, as he describes what happened to Nadav Avihu, a person feels the true pleasantness and sweetness of being connected to Hashem. And this then he puts in his full effort to be totally connected to Hashem and to detach entirely from worldly matters. That's one reason that one would have a motive for Ratzoi. So it's coming as a result of the appreciation of the great sweetness and beauty of being connected to Hashem. Then there is an totally opposite extreme reason that would motivate a person to want to get detached from this world and get attached totally and absolutely to Hashem. And that is when a person realizes the lowliness of this world. And this triggers in the person a desire to escape, to run away from any and all involvement in worldly matters, because he feels like they threaten his connection to Hashem. And therefore, he wants to be totally connected to Hashem. That is to run away from the world. In generally speaking, this is really these two varying triggers, these two varying motivations actually can be divided, can be separated into the two categories of Yoshvei Ohel versus the Bali Asik. The people who are totally immersed in Torah, they're sitting in the tents, quote unquote, meaning they're sitting in the tents of Torah, mitzvahs, totally in a spiritual realm all the time, or almost all of the time, versus the people who are involved in worldly matters, going to the day to day, going to work, dealing with worldly matters, of course also learning Torah and so on, as we said in the introduction, but yet primarily they are not sitting in yeshiva, they're not sitting in kollel, they're working in the world. You see, what happens is a Yoshev Ohel is by nature, by virtue of what he does, he's removed from worldly matters. He's totally immersed in godliness. And therefore, there is no need to forewarn him, to caution him that he shouldn't get caught up in worldly matters. On the contrary, he needs to be cautioned that he shouldn't, quote unquote, fly too high. He shouldn't soar too high in spirituality and get totally removed from this world. That he needs to remember that at the end of the day, the Torah, as it says in the sages say in the Talmud, quote unquote, Torah loy b'shamayim, the Torah is not in the heavens. The Torah is meant to be here. It's Hashem's desire, it was Hashem's will, that everything gets decided and gets accomplished down here. Even the Holy Torah, in order to decide law, it doesn't happen up there in the heavenly court, but it happens down here in this world. Moreover, not only is this in regards to what we call Galya de Torah, the revealed part of the Torah, which deals in obviously worldly matters. Thus, it's obvious that the laws need to get decided, quote unquote, down here. But moreover, even in the secretive part of the Torah, the esoteric part of the Torah also gets established here. As the Alter Rebbe explains the story which we introduced in the introduction, which clearly proves that when there was a discussion in heaven, in order to determine which side is right, they said they need somebody that's living in real life down here in this world. Says the Alter Rebbe explains it, that it was not a matter of law, of nigla, but rather it was a matter of razin de uraisa, of the secrets of the Torah. So in short, what you see over here, to summarize, is that somebody who's a Baal who's a Yoshev Ohel, somebody who's totally immersed in Torah, what is the caution that he's given? Do not soar too high. Do not fly too high. Do not even get removed from this world. You still need to remain with your feet on the ground. You still need to do your part to remain in the world, even though you're involved more in the spiritual line. Now, on the other hand, the other extreme, you have the Baal Asik, the person who's involved in worldly matters. He needs to be cautioned that since he's in the world and he experiences the lowliness of worldly matters, so therefore he may argue and say, how can I deal with this? How can I deal with this and remain in the world and remain a frum Jew and so on? And still, have my true integrity as my identity as a Jew and as a holy person? And perhaps, therefore, he might have this thought of maybe running away from it all and to, quote unquote, come into the holies. In other words, get detached totally from this world and go into the Holy of Holies, become just spiritual, become removed from the world. This is what the Torah tells him. You cannot go into the holies at all times, meaning you need to remain in the world. Hashem wants a dira b'tachtoim. Hashem wants you to remain in this world. And if that's the case, that Hashem wants you to be here, then most certainly He gives you the ability, gives you the resources to be able to combat the difficulties and to deal with it and to not get sucked into it. And now we'll appreciate why the Torah splits these two directives in these two different locations. The first one came to the Kohanim. to Aaron and his sons, immediately after the occurrence. What do the Kohanim represent? The Kohanim spend their time, the priests spend their time in the Beis HaMikdash, in the holies. That is a representative of the Yoshev oil. And what are they told? Yayin v'sheichar al teisht. Do not drink wine. Do not get intoxicated by wine. We know that wine represents the secret parts of the Torah, the esoteric part of the Torah. And that's what he's saying. Do not get totally and absolutely intoxicated by it. When you become intoxicated, it means you detach from reality. No, you must remain in your reality. None of an Avihu wanted to become totally detached because they appreciated how great it is to get close to Hashem. That is not an option. And in other words, they had the Rotzoi without the Shuv. They had the Rotzoi, they had the thrust forward, but without any plans for coming back to reality and bringing it back with them and implementing it down here in this world. Now, once the Torah instructed the Yoshvei Oil, the Kohanim, now the Torah discusses then the various animals, which this is representative of our animalistic soul. The pure aspects of it, the impure aspects of it, what to be cautious about, how to deal with it to make sure that even our animal soul remains holy. But sometimes a person is not successful. Thus come the next few parshiot where you talk about, where the discussion is about severe impurities, where a person becomes totally and absolutely impure to the extent that he has to be cast outside not only of the holies, but even of the community. And he has to be isolated because that's the severe impurity that he brought upon himself or that came upon him. So this represents when a person perhaps is severely affected by worldly matters, to the extent that we come to this parsha, that you need a Yom Kippur, you need a special day, a special method, a special agent of atonement. Atonement means to wipe away the sins. Yes, the world affected a person. And therefore the person might have this moment of epiphany and say to themselves, well, if that's the case, look at me. What should I do? Let me get away from the world. Let me totally dislodge myself from worldly matters and go into the holies. Let me change what I do. I don't want to be involved in worldly matters anymore. Let me go totally and absolutely to be immersed in holiness. That's where the Torah tells us, in conjunction with Yom Kippur, when you do need an atonement, and it's obviously for reason of having gone too far and having gotten sucked into worldly matters. And therefore the Torah tells us, no, still, yet, do not come all times and any time into the holies. Meaning you only can come in the authorized, allocated times. During the 6 days of the week, you have to be at work. At work, do your best, and you have the resources of it to not get sucked into worldly matters with all the temptations that exist around you. There are certain situations in which you get your spiritual batteries charged. Yes, there is the Yom Kippur, there is the Shabbos, there is the Yom Tov, and so on and so forth. And now we can appreciate what the Torah is telling us, to whom it's speaking, and therefore why it put it in these two different locations.